My name is Isabella Martinez, and for 8 years, I believed I was living the kind of love story they write novels about. Marcus and I met during my second year of law school, when I was drowning in contracts law and surviving on coffee and determination. He was finishing his pediatric surgery residency at OHSU, this brilliant, gentle man who could save children's lives before lunch and still remember to bring me soup when I had the flu. We fell in love in those stolen moments between his 36-hour shifts and my all-night study sessions, whispering our dreams into the darkness of his cramped studio apartment overlooking the Willamette River. By 34, I'd made partner at Morrison & Associates, one of Portland's most prestigious firms, specializing in corporate litigation. Marcus had built a reputation as one of the finest pediatric surgeons on the West Coast, the kind of doctor other doctors called when their own children needed saving. We lived in a glass-walled penthouse in the Pearl District, all clean lines and city views, where the morning light painted everything golden and the evening fog rolled in like a blessing. Our life looked perfect from every angle: successful careers, financial security, a marriage that friends envied and strangers admired. But lately, the golden light felt cold. Marcus, at 36, still turned heads when we walked into restaurants, tall and lean with those surgeon's hands that moved with precise grace, dark hair just starting to silver at the temples, giving him that distinguished look that made nurses blush and made me proud to be his wife. But something had shifted in the last 6 months, subtle as a hairline fracture in expensive crystal. He'd started coming home later, his scrubs wrinkled in ways that spoke of long days, but his eyes held a distance that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Our conversations, once rich with shared dreams and inside jokes, had become polite exchanges about schedules and obligations. The intimacy we'd built over 8 years had withered to perfunctory kisses and mechanical routines. I'd catch him staring at his phone with an expression I couldn't read, his thumbs moving across the screen with the same focused intensity he brought to surgery. When I'd ask who he was texting, he'd give me that practiced smile, the one he used with difficult hospital administrators, and say, "Just work stuff, babe. Nothing interesting." The children question loomed between us like an unspoken accusation. For years, whenever I'd brought up starting a family, Marcus would kiss my forehead and murmur, "Soon, Isabella. The timing just isn't right yet." At first, I'd understood. Surgical residencies were brutal, his practice was building, my career was demanding. But 8 years of not yet had calcified into something that felt more like never, though neither of us dared say it aloud. Before I tell you what I discovered in the depths of my perfect marriage, I need you to understand something. This story will change how you look at the person sleeping next to you. If you've ever felt that nagging whisper in your gut telling you something isn't right, if you've ever caught your partner in small lies that felt too insignificant to challenge but too persistent to ignore, stay with me. Because what I found hiding beneath 8 years of I love you and shared morning coffee will make you question everything you think you know about the person you married. And if this story helps even one woman trust her instincts instead of her hopes, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Now, let me tell you about the day my perfect marriage cracked wide open, and how a little black box smaller than my wedding ring revealed the truth I'd been too afraid to see. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday in late September, disguised as something as mundane as laundry. I was emptying Marcus's pockets before dropping his shirts at the dry cleaner, our routine for 8 years, mine by choice since he claimed to never remember to check. Most days yielded the usual debris of a surgeon's life: gum wrappers, parking receipts from the hospital garage, the occasional business card from a medical conference. But that Tuesday, a crumpled receipt fluttered to the floor like a dying leaf, and when I smoothed it out, my world tilted slightly off its axis. Jade Garden Restaurant, 82nd Avenue, Southeast Portland. $47.83 for 2 entrees, paid in cash at 2:15 p.m. on a Thursday when Marcus had sworn he was stuck in emergency surgery until 9 that night. I stood there in our climate-controlled bedroom, holding this innocent piece of paper that felt suddenly radioactive in my fingers. The address was in Jade District, 45 minutes from the hospital, in a part of town where Marcus had no reason to be. No medical conferences, no colleagues, no clients. Just a working-class neighborhood of strip malls and small businesses where a pediatric surgeon would stand out like a Rolex in a pawn shop. My rational mind, the same one that had gotten me through law school and courtroom battles, immediately began constructing explanations. Maybe he'd grabbed lunch with a colleague. Maybe it was a recruitment meeting for the hospital's outreach program. Maybe. But my gut, the instinct that had never steered me wrong in depositions or contract negotiations, whispered something darker. 2 entrees. Cash payment. A part of town he'd never mentioned visiting. I tucked the receipt into my jewelry box, beneath the velvet tray that held my grandmother's pearls, and told myself I was being paranoid. Successful marriages were built on trust, not suspicion. Marcus was a good man, a surgeon who dedicated his life to saving children. He loved me. We had a life together. One receipt didn't mean anything. But once planted, doubt grew like a weed. Over the next few weeks, I found myself paying attention in ways I hadn't before. The way Marcus would take phone calls in the garage, his voice too low for me to hear through the walls. How he'd started showering immediately when he came home, before even kissing me hello. The new cologne he'd begun wearing, something woody and expensive that I'd never chosen for him. Small things, each explainable on its own, but together they formed a pattern that made my skin crawl. I started taking note of his schedule discrepancies. Thursday nights at the hospital that ended too early for the overtime pay stubs I balanced in our joint account. Saturday morning golf with colleagues that left him smelling like something other than the pine-scented air of the country club. Medical conferences in nearby cities that required overnight stays but never appeared in his professional development records. The breaking point came on a rain-soaked evening in early October. I was scrolling through Instagram, mindlessly double-tapping vacation photos and baby announcements, when a targeted ad appeared at the bottom of my feed. Discover the truth, discreet GPS tracking devices for peace of mind. $89.99, free shipping. The image showed a sleek black device no bigger than a matchbox, promising real-time location tracking and magnetic mounting for easy installation. My thumb hovered over the ad, heart hammering against my ribs. This felt like a violation of everything I believed about marriage, about trust, about the kind of woman I thought I was. Good wives didn't spy on their husbands. Confident women didn't need to track their partners like criminals. But as I sat there in our perfect living room, rain drumming against the floor-to-ceiling windows, I realized I wasn't feeling like a good wife or a confident woman. I was feeling like a fool. I closed the app and went to bed, where Marcus was already asleep, turned away from me, his breathing deep and untroubled. But at 3 a.m., as he slept peacefully beside me, I found myself back on my phone, credit card in hand, placing an order for a device that would either save my marriage or destroy it. The tracker arrived 2 days later in plain brown packaging, addressed to my office to avoid Marcus seeing it. I slipped it into my purse and carried it around for a week, this small weight that felt enormous with possibility and dread. Every day I told myself I would return it, that I was better than this, that love meant trust. But every evening, as Marcus kissed my cheek with lips that tasted like secrets, I knew I was going to use it. Friday night arrived with the weight of inevitability. Marcus suggested dinner at Le Pigeon, the restaurant where he'd proposed 3 years earlier, his way of marking our anniversary without acknowledging that something between us was dying. I smiled and agreed, playing the role of the grateful wife while my purse held a device that would either confirm my paranoia or my husband's betrayal. Dinner was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Marcus ordered my favorite wine without asking, remembered that I preferred my steak medium rare, told stories about his young patients that made my heart ache with love and loss simultaneously. He was being the man I'd fallen in love with, attentive and charming and present in all the ways he hadn't been for months. As we shared creme brulee, he took my hand across the white tablecloth and said, "I'm sorry I've been distant lately, Bella. Work has been brutal, but that's no excuse. I love you." I believed him in that moment, wanted to believe him so desperately that I almost excused myself to throw the tracker in the restaurant's dumpster. But love and trust aren't the same thing, and 8 years of marriage had taught me the difference. When we returned home, Marcus disappeared into the bathroom for his new ritual of immediate post-dinner showers. I slipped into the garage, my bare feet silent on the concrete floor. His black Audi sat there like a sleeping predator, all German engineering and understated wealth. My hands shook as I knelt beside the rear wheel well, the concrete cold and unforgiving against my knees. The tracker's magnetic backing clicked into place with a sound like a closing coffin, hidden in the shadow where no casual observer would notice. I downloaded the app on my phone, heart pounding as I created an account under a false name. The device synced immediately, showing Marcus's car as a blue dot in our building's parking garage. Vehicle online appeared on the screen, and just like that, I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Monday morning brought the first test. Marcus left for the hospital at 7 a.m. as usual, kissing my forehead and promising to be home by 6 for dinner. I watched from our bedroom window as his Audi pulled onto the street, then immediately checked the app. The blue dot moved northwest toward OHSU, exactly where it should be. For a moment, relief flooded through me. Maybe I really was paranoid. Maybe the late nights and strange receipts had innocent explanations. The relief lasted until 4:30 p.m. I was in a client meeting, reviewing merger documents, when my phone buzzed with a location alert. Marcus's car had moved from the hospital parking structure. Instead of heading northwest toward home, the blue dot was traveling southeast, away from our neighborhood, away from any route that made sense for a surgeon finishing his shift. I excused myself from the meeting, claiming a family emergency, and watched in real time as the dot made its way through traffic toward a destination I didn't recognize. 1847, Hawthorne Street, Southeast Portland. A modest residential neighborhood 40 minutes from the hospital, 20 minutes from our penthouse. The car had stopped, the blue dot stationary, and according to the timestamp, Marcus would be there for exactly 2 hours and 37 minutes before heading home with some lie about overtime surgery or unexpected consultations. Tuesday, same time, same location. 2 hours and 41 minutes. Wednesday, 4:35 p.m. departure from the hospital, arrival at 1847, Hawthorne Street by 5:20 p.m., home by 8:15 p.m. with takeout from a Thai restaurant I'd never heard of and an apology about emergency surgery running late. By Thursday, the pattern was carved into my consciousness like a scar. Every weekday at precisely 4:30 p.m., Marcus would leave the hospital and drive to this mysterious address, spending between 2 and 3 hours at a location he'd never mentioned, with people he'd never named, living a slice of life that had nothing to do with me. I found myself obsessing over the app, checking it compulsively during court breaks and client dinners. The blue dot became my tormentor and my companion, the only honest thing in my marriage. I would watch it move through the city like a fever dream, this digital breadcrumb trail leading to a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to find. Sleep became elusive. I would lie beside Marcus, listening to his peaceful breathing, knowing that in 8 hours he would wake up, kiss me goodbye, and drive to his secret life while I pretended not to know. The weight of this knowledge sat on my chest like a stone, making every breath an effort, every smile a performance. The worst part wasn't the deception. It was the precision of it. This wasn't a spontaneous affair or a moment of weakness. This was methodical, planned, a second life maintained with the same surgical precision Marcus brought to his operating room. Someone was expecting him at 1847 Hawthorne Street every single weekday. Someone who mattered enough for him to risk everything we'd built together. As Friday's blue dot made its familiar journey southeast, I sat in my corner office watching the Portland skyline blur with unshed tears, and realized that our 8-year marriage had become a lie I was living, and Marcus was just better at pretending than I was. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather that made staying in bed seem like the only rational choice. Marcus was at the hospital for what he called emergency rounds, another convenient excuse that had become as routine as his morning coffee. I told him I was spending the day at the spa, a lie that rolled off my tongue with disturbing ease. Instead, I found myself driving southeast through Portland's rain-slicked streets, following a route my husband's blue dot had traced 5 times that week. The drive from our pristine Pearl District penthouse to southeast Portland felt like traveling between worlds. Glass towers and artisanal coffee shops gave way to modest bungalows with chain-link fences and cars that had seen better decades. Hawthorne Street stretched before me like a revelation, lined with the kind of working-class homes where people actually lived instead of just existing in architectural statements. Number 1847 sat halfway down the block, a small craftsman-style house painted sage green with white trim. The front yard was meticulously maintained, roses still blooming despite the October chill, a lawn edged with the precision of someone who cared deeply about appearances. A concrete ramp led to the front porch, the kind of modification that spoke of accessibility needs, and wind chimes hung from the eaves, their gentle music barely audible over the rain's steady percussion. I parked 2 blocks away, my hands trembling as I pulled a baseball cap low over my face and zipped my rain jacket to my chin. The neighborhood was quiet in that Saturday morning way, with only the occasional dog walker or jogger to witness my transformation into a woman I didn't recognize, someone who spied on her own husband, someone who sat in her car like a private investigator or a stalker. At exactly 10:30 a.m., Marcus's Audi turned onto Hawthorne Street. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him park in the driveway with the casual familiarity of someone who belonged there. He emerged from the car carrying 2 grocery bags from Whole Foods, our usual store, charged to our joint credit card, and walked up the ramp to the front door. He didn't knock. He had a key. The front door opened before he reached it, and a woman appeared in the doorway. Even from 2 blocks away, I could see her smile, the way her whole body seemed to light up at the sight of him. She was younger than me, maybe early 30s, with long dark hair pulled into a ponytail and the kind of effortless beauty that came from someone who didn't spend their mornings applying concealer under courtroom-quality lighting. Marcus kissed her cheek, a gesture so casual, so domestic, that it felt like a physical blow. They disappeared inside together, the door closing behind them with a finality that left me gasping in my car, rain drumming on the roof like accusations. I waited. And waited. The house remained quiet, curtains drawn, giving away nothing of the drama unfolding inside my marriage. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement through the kitchen window, 2 figures moving around each other with the choreographed ease of people who had done this dance many times before. After an hour of surveillance that felt like a lifetime, I gathered enough courage to leave my car and walk past the house. The mailbox read chin, and through a gap in the living room curtains, I glimpsed something that stopped me cold, an elderly woman in a wheelchair, her silver hair carefully styled, her hands folded in her lap as she stared out the window with the vacant expression of someone whose mind had wandered far from her body. This wasn't an affair. This was something else entirely. I spent the rest of the afternoon canvassing the neighborhood with the casual persistence of a lost tourist. The elderly man next door, tending his rain-soaked garden, was happy to chat about the sweet family at 1847. That young man is so devoted, he told me, shaking his head in admiration. Comes every single day to take care of his mother-in-law. Such a rare thing these days, family loyalty like that. Mother-in-law. The words echoed in my head as I smiled and nodded, playing the role of the interested stranger while my world crumbled around me. The woman at the corner market knew them too. Marcus? Oh yes, he's wonderful. Been taking care of Eleanor for years now, ever since her diagnosis. Brings her flowers every Friday, always asks about her favorite foods. His wife Sarah helps too, but you can tell the burden weighs on them both. Alzheimer's is such a cruel disease. Wife Sarah. Not girlfriend, not mistress. Wife. Sunday passed in a blur of normalcy that felt like performance art. Marcus made pancakes, we read the newspaper in bed, we attended a dinner party where I smiled and laughed and played the role of the happy wife while inside, I was drowning in questions that threatened to pull me under. When Monday morning arrived, I called in sick for the first time in 3 years and drove straight to the Multnomah County Courthouse. Public records don't lie the way people do. They sit in filing cabinets and computer databases, waiting patiently to reveal truths that can destroy lives with their bureaucratic precision. I'd used property records hundreds of times in corporate litigation, tracing ownership chains and uncovering hidden assets. Now I was using those same skills to investigate my own husband, my hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. 1847, Hawthorne Street, Portland, Oregon. Owner, Dr. Eleanor Chen, purchased in 2019. Previous address, Seattle, Washington. The trail led me through mortgage documents and tax records, each piece of paper another breadcrumb leading toward a truth I wasn't sure I could survive. But it was the marriage license that shattered what remained of my world. King County, Washington. Marriage certificate. Groom, Marcus David Chin, age 29. Bride, Eleanor Rose Nguyen, age 31. Date, September 15, 2008. Witnessed by David Chin, Susan Nguyen. Officiant, Judge Patricia Williams. 15 years ago. 7 years before I met him. Marcus had been married before, and apparently, he still was. My vision blurred as I stared at the certificate, the official state seal mocking me with its authority. There was no divorce decree in the files, no legal dissolution, no record of the marriage ending. Just this piece of paper that predated our entire relationship, that made our 8-year marriage a legal impossibility. I sat in the courthouse records room, surrounded by the debris of other people's legal disputes, and felt my carefully constructed life crumble into dust. Every anniversary we'd celebrated, every I love you he'd whispered, every plan we'd made for the future, all of it built on a foundation of lies. The medical records came next, accessed through professional courtesy and a legal research database I'd used for malpractice cases. Dr. Eleanor Chen, neurologist, graduated from Johns Hopkins, former chief of staff at Seattle Presbyterian Hospital. Diagnosis, early-onset Alzheimer's disease, documented progression over 5 years. Primary caregiver and medical proxy, Marcus David Chen, spouse. Spouse. Not ex-spouse. Spouse. The timeline fell into place with surgical precision. Eleanor's diagnosis in 2017, the same year Marcus had seemed so distant, so stressed about work. The move to Portland in 2019, when he'd told me it was for a better position at OHSU. The house on Hawthorne Street, purchased in Eleanor's name but funded by bank transfers I now recognized from our joint account statements. I'd been subsidizing my husband's care for his first wife for 3 years without knowing it. The hospital employment records revealed the final piece of the puzzle. Marcus wasn't just Eleanor's caregiver, he was her medical proxy, making decisions about her treatment, her medications, her quality of life. The young woman I'd seen at the house, the one who'd kissed his cheek with such familiarity, wasn't his mistress. She was Eleanor's daughter from a previous relationship, a stepdaughter who'd become his ally in caring for a woman whose mind was slowly disappearing. I drove home through downtown Portland in a daze, the city's familiar landmarks looking foreign and strange, like scenery from someone else's life. Our penthouse felt like a museum when I walked through the door, all our shared possessions suddenly alien to me. Wedding photos that had seemed romantic now looked like evidence of fraud. The ring on my finger felt like a costume piece from a play I'd never auditioned for. That evening, Marcus came home at his usual time, carrying takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant and wearing the same expression of mild exhaustion he'd perfected over the years. He kissed my forehead and asked about my day, and I answered with lies that came as easily as breathing. We ate dinner and watched Netflix and went to bed, and I lay beside him in the darkness, listening to the breathing of a stranger who'd shared my bed for 8 years. The bank records painted the most damning picture of all. I spent Tuesday morning locked in my home office, my laptop screen glowing with evidence of financial betrayal that went back years, not months. Every mysterious withdrawal, every unexplained transfer, every cash advance that Marcus had attributed to personal expenses or investment opportunities, all of it had been funding Eleanor's care. $3,200 monthly transfers to compassionate care services. Medical expenses totaling $89,000 over 3 years. The down payment for the Hawthorne Street house, $75,000, withdrawn from our joint savings the same week Marcus had convinced me to postpone our European anniversary trip because of market volatility. I'd been living in a marriage that was legally non-existent while unknowingly bankrolling my husband's devotion to his real wife. The cruelest revelation was in the details. The specialized wheelchair I'd seen through the window, $8,000, charged to our Visa card and disguised as medical equipment research for the hospital. The home modifications, the ramp, the bathroom renovations, the security system, all funded by a woman who didn't know she was paying for another woman's comfort. Marcus's phone records, subpoenaed through a legal contact who owed me a favor, revealed daily conversations with Eleanor's neurologist, her physical therapist, her nutritionist. Text message timestamps showed him coordinating her care between surgeries, arranging appointments during his lunch breaks, living a completely parallel life that revolved around a woman whose existence he'd erased from our marriage. But it was the voicemails that broke me completely. "Hi darling, it's me. I'm having one of my clearer days, and I wanted you to know how grateful I am. I know this isn't easy, taking care of me when I can't even remember Sarah's name half the time. But you're my anchor, Marcus. You always have been. I love you so much." Eleanor's voice was soft, cultured, with a slight accent that spoke of childhood in another country. In her lucid moments, she was grateful for Marcus's devotion, apologetic about her condition, completely unaware that her husband was living a double life. She wasn't the villain in this story. She was another victim of Marcus's elaborate deception. The reality crashed over me like a tide. I wasn't the wife being betrayed by a cheating husband. I was the other woman, the unknowing mistress in someone else's marriage. For 8 years, I'd been living in a bigamous relationship, my legal status no different from a concubine or a kept woman. Every court appearance I'd made as Mrs. Chin, every insurance form I'd signed, every tax return we'd filed jointly, all of it fraudulent. Marcus had never divorced Eleanor because you can't divorce someone who's slowly disappearing into the fog of dementia. He'd simply created a new life alongside the one he couldn't abandon, compartmentalizing his heart and his obligations with the same precision he brought to separating conjoined twins. That night, as Marcus sat at his desk paying bills with the methodical care of a man managing 2 households, I watched him through our bedroom doorway and finally understood the weight he'd been carrying. The late nights weren't affairs, they were extra shifts to pay for Eleanor's increasing medical needs. The distance wasn't emotional withdrawal, it was the exhaustion of a man trying to be a husband to 2 women, one of whom was dying by degrees. I should have felt compassion. Instead, all I felt was rage. Because in his misguided attempt to protect everyone, Marcus had stolen my choices, my autonomy, my right to decide whether I wanted to be part of this heartbreaking triangle. He'd made me complicit in a lie I'd never agreed to live, turned me into a fraud who'd been claiming a name that wasn't legally mine. As I closed my laptop and deleted my browser history, I realized that confronting Marcus wouldn't be enough. This wasn't a marriage that could be fixed with counseling or compromise. This was a fundamental deception that had corrupted every aspect of our life together. I was going to have to decide whether to destroy him or walk away quietly, and for the first time in 8 years, I had no idea which choice would hurt less. Wednesday morning found me standing outside 1847 Hawthorne Street, clipboard in hand, wearing the kind of sensible navy blazer and practical flats that screamed government employee. I'd spent 2 hours crafting my disguise, hair pulled back in a severe bun, minimal makeup, wire-rimmed glasses borrowed from a prop closet at my firm's mock trial practice room. The ID badge hanging from my neck identified me as Janet Morrison, Adult Protective Services, created with the same Photoshop skills I'd learned for trial presentations. The young woman who answered the door was prettier up close than she'd appeared from my surveillance position. Mid-20s, with Marcus's same dark eyes and high cheekbones, his stepdaughter Sarah, I'd learned from my research. Her face immediately shifted from wariness to professional concern when she saw my badge. "Good morning," I said, my voice pitched higher than usual, carrying the slightly nasal tone of bureaucratic authority. "I'm Janet Morrison from Adult Protective Services. We received a wellness report regarding Dr. Eleanor Chin. May I come in for a brief assessment?" Sarah's face paled slightly, but she stepped aside. "Of course. Is everything all right?" Did someone file a complaint? Just routine follow-up, I lied smoothly, following her into a home that felt like walking into Marcus's hidden heart. The living room was warm and lived in, with medical equipment discreetly integrated into comfortable furniture. A hospital bed had been positioned near the front window, allowing whoever slept there to watch the street activity. Framed photographs covered every surface: Marcus and Eleanor's wedding day, vacation photos from what looked like European trips, graduations, and holidays spanning decades. Eleanor sat in her wheelchair near the window, sunlight highlighting the silver in her carefully styled hair. She was smaller than I'd expected, probably barely 5 feet tall, with delicate hands that bore a wedding ring I recognized, the same antique setting Marcus had told me belonged to his grandmother. The ring he'd claimed held such sentimental value that he'd had it specially sized for my finger. Except now I realized he'd never had it sized for me. He'd simply given me a replica while the original remained where it belonged. "Eleanor," Sarah said gently, approaching her mother with the careful tenderness of someone accustomed to navigating the minefield of dementia. "There's a lady here to see you." Eleanor looked up with eyes that held flickers of intelligence trapped behind gathering fog. "Is Marcus coming today?" she asked, her voice carrying the musical quality I'd heard in the voicemails. "He promised to bring me orchids. Purple ones. They're my favorite." "He'll be here later, Mom," Sarah replied, the word mom carrying years of chosen love rather than biology. She turned to me. "She has good days and difficult days. Today seems to be somewhere in between." I sat in the chair beside Eleanor's wheelchair, close enough to see the careful makeup someone had applied to give her a sense of dignity, the way her hair had been styled with old-fashioned elegance. This wasn't a woman being neglected or abandoned. This was a woman being loved with the kind of devotion that came at enormous personal cost. "Hello, Eleanor," I said gently. "I'm Janet. How are you feeling today?" Her eyes focused on me with sudden clarity that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "I'm forgetting everything," she said matter-of-factly. "But I remember Marcus. He's my anchor in all this confusion. Do you know him? He's a surgeon. Saves children." The words hit me like physical blows. This woman, even in her deteriorating state, spoke of my husband with such pure love that it made my chest ache. She wasn't a rival or an obstacle. She was a woman slowly drowning in her own mind, holding on to Marcus as her one constant in a world that must feel increasingly alien and terrifying. Sarah excused herself to make tea, leaving me alone with Eleanor. On the side table next to her wheelchair, I noticed a small stack of cards, the kind of romantic greeting cards sold at drugstores. The top one was opened, revealing Marcus's careful handwriting. "My dearest Eleanor, even though you may not remember yesterday, I want you to know that you are loved today and will be loved tomorrow. Your devoted husband, Marcus." "He writes to me," Eleanor said, noticing my gaze. "Sometimes I can't remember who he is, but the cards help. Love letters, he calls them. Isn't that romantic?" I nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in my throat. This woman wasn't a secret Marcus was hiding from shame. She was a responsibility he was protecting, a love he was honoring even as it cost him everything else he might have wanted. Sarah returned with tea and began explaining Eleanor's routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd given this presentation before. Physical therapy 3 times a week, medication schedules, dietary restrictions, behavioral patterns that helped predict good days from bad ones. She spoke of Marcus with a reverence that made it clear he wasn't just fulfilling an obligation, he was the hero of this small, tragic world. "He reads to her every evening," Sarah explained. "Poetry, mostly. She was a literature professor before medicine, and sometimes the rhythm of verse brings her back to herself. And he brings fresh flowers twice a week, always in colors she mentioned loving years ago." As I sat in that living room, surrounded by the artifacts of a marriage that predated mine, watching Eleanor struggle to remember her own daughter's name while speaking of Marcus with perfect clarity, I realized I wasn't investigating an affair. I was witnessing a love story that was both beautiful and devastating, a devotion so complete it had made my husband into both a saint and a criminal. That evening, I sat in my car outside the house until long after Marcus's Audi had pulled into the driveway. Through the living room window, I watched him help Eleanor with her dinner, his movements gentle and practiced. He wiped her chin when she spilled soup, laughed at something she said, held her hand while she struggled to find words that seemed to dance just beyond her reach. This wasn't duty or obligation. This was love in its purest, most painful form. I drove home through Portland's early evening traffic, my mind reeling with the complexity of what I'd witnessed. Every assumption I'd made, every narrative I'd constructed about Marcus's betrayal, had crumbled in the face of Eleanor's reality. How do you rage against a man who's sacrificing everything to care for a woman whose mind is slowly disappearing? How do you compete with love that's been refined by loss into something approaching the sacred? But beneath my newfound understanding, anger still burned like a coal in my chest. Understanding Marcus's motivations didn't excuse 8 years of deception. His noble sacrifice had been funded by my ignorance, my trust, my unknowing complicity in a fraud that had stolen my right to make informed choices about my own life. I spent the next 2 days researching Alzheimer's care with the same methodical thoroughness I brought to complex litigation. The statistics were staggering: average annual cost of $321,000 for round-the-clock specialized care. Median survival time of 4 to 8 years from diagnosis. Families driven into bankruptcy, marriages destroyed by the financial and emotional strain, patients warehoused in understaffed facilities where dignity went to die. Marcus had chosen a different path. He'd kept Eleanor at home with private care, ensuring she maintained her independence and comfort for as long as possible. The financial records I'd uncovered told the story of a man systematically liquidating his future to preserve his past, cashing out retirement accounts, taking second mortgages, living far below his means to fund a level of care that most families couldn't even imagine. The cruelest irony was that I'd been complicit in this nobility without knowing it. Every time I'd agreed to postpone our vacation, every sacrifice I'd made to build our joint savings, every dollar I'd contributed to our shared life had been redirected toward Eleanor's care. I'd been a silent partner in Marcus's devotion, funding love letters to another woman with money I'd earned in courtrooms where I fought for justice and truth. Thursday evening, while Marcus was at his hospital rounds, I broke into his home office. The locked desk drawer surrendered to a paperclip with embarrassing ease, revealing a treasure trove of evidence that shattered my heart all over again. Love letters. Dozens of them, written in Marcus's careful hand but never sent. My beloved Eleanor, one began, "Today you asked me who I was, and I told you I was your husband. For a moment, you smiled, and I saw the woman I married looking back at me. These glimpses of you are what keep me going." Another, dated just 2 weeks ago, "The doctor says your decline is accelerating. Soon, you won't remember my name at all. But I want you to know that loving you, caring for you, fighting for you, has been the honor of my life. If I could trade places with you, if I could take this disease into my own mind so you could be free, I would do it without hesitation." The letters revealed a man in agony, torn between honoring his vows to a woman who was disappearing and his growing love for someone else, me. He wrote about our life together with guilt and longing. "Isabella deserves so much more than what I can give her. She deserves a husband who comes home to her completely, not someone who's been hollowed out by grief and responsibility. But I can't abandon Eleanor, and I can't explain the truth without destroying both the women I love." In the margins of some letters, I found notes about our relationship, reminders to pick up my favorite wine, ideas for anniversary gifts, observations about my work stress and how he might help. Even in his deepest despair about Eleanor, Marcus had been trying to love me well, trying to be present in our marriage despite carrying a weight that would have crushed most men. The final revelation came in a medical consultation report tucked behind the letters. Eleanor's neurologist had recommended residential care 6 months ago, but Marcus had refused. The cost of keeping her at home was bankrupting him, but the alternative, watching her die among strangers in an institutional setting, was unthinkable. His refusal to have children with me suddenly made perfect sense. Every dollar spent on fertility treatments or nursery preparations was a dollar stolen from Eleanor's care. Marcus hadn't been avoiding fatherhood out of selfishness or fear. He'd been protecting Eleanor's dignity with our dreams of the future. I sat in his chair, surrounded by evidence of a love so profound it had consumed our marriage, and finally understood the impossible position he'd put himself in. He couldn't divorce Eleanor without abandoning her to institutional care. He couldn't tell me the truth without making me complicit in his deception. He couldn't choose between us because one choice meant betraying his vows while the other meant destroying the chance at happiness he'd found with me. Marcus had tried to love two women completely and had ended up betraying us both, Eleanor through his emotional affair with me, and me through his legal commitment to her. In his attempt to honor everyone, he'd created a triangle of deceit that had doomed all three of us to different kinds of suffering. Friday morning found me in the law library at Morrison & Associates, surrounded by legal texts and case precedents, building a strategy with the same ruthless precision I'd learned in corporate litigation. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about untangling a web of deception that had trapped three people in a legally and morally untenable situation. Bigamy laws in Oregon were clear: second marriages performed while a legal spouse still lived were void from the moment they occurred. My 8-year marriage to Marcus had never existed in the eyes of the law. I was a legal stranger to him, with no rights to property, no claim to assets, no protection under spousal privilege. Worse, Marcus's fraud had made me an unwitting accessory to tax evasion, insurance fraud, and a dozen other financial crimes committed when we'd filed joint returns and shared accounts. But the legal complexities went deeper than simple bigamy. As Eleanor's medical proxy and legal spouse, Marcus had the right to make decisions about her care, her property, her medical treatment. If Eleanor died, Marcus would inherit her assets automatically, including the house I'd been unknowingly helping to pay for. My financial contributions to their life had no legal standing. They were gifts made under fraudulent pretenses, unrecoverable under Washington's no-fault divorce laws that didn't apply to marriages that had never legally existed. The documentation I'd gathered painted a clear picture of systematic fraud spanning nearly a decade. Bank records showing transfers from our joint accounts to Eleanor's care providers. Tax returns filed as married filing jointly when Marcus was already legally married to someone else. Insurance policies listing me as his wife and beneficiary while he maintained separate policies with Eleanor in the same role. Federal charges were possible. Mail fraud for the false tax returns, wire fraud for the electronic transfers, potentially even RICO violations if the prosecution decided to view Marcus's dual life as an ongoing criminal enterprise. The medical licensing board would revoke his credentials immediately. His reputation, his career, his ability to care for Eleanor, all of it would be destroyed if this became public. Which gave me leverage. Saturday afternoon, I called Rosa, the caregiver I'd met briefly during my social worker charade. The conversation was delicate, requiring me to reveal just enough truth to gain her trust without exposing the full scope of my deception. "Rosa, this is Janet Morrison from Adult Protective Services," I began, using my fake identity one last time. "I wanted to follow up on my visit earlier this week. I may need to speak with you privately about Dr. Chen's care situation." Rosa's English was careful but clear, her concern for Eleanor evident in every word. "Is there a problem?" "Marcus, he is very good man. Eleanor, she is safe, very loved." "I'm sure she is," I replied. "But there are some financial irregularities in how her care is being funded that I need to understand better. Could we meet somewhere private? What you tell me could help protect Eleanor and ensure her care continues uninterrupted." We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in neutral territory, away from the house where Marcus might see us together. Rosa was a small woman in her 50s, originally from El Salvador, who'd been caring for Eleanor for 3 years with the kind of devotion that went far beyond professional obligation. Over coffee and pastries, I carefully explained a version of the truth, that Eleanor's husband had been using funds from questionable sources to pay for her care, and that an investigation might result in criminal charges that could leave Eleanor without resources or protection. Marcus, he has other wife? Rosa asked, her eyes widening as she grasped the implications. This is why he is so sad sometimes, so tired. I think maybe he has girlfriend, but another wife. Rosa's testimony would be crucial if this went to trial. She'd witnessed Marcus's daily devotion to Eleanor, could speak to the quality of care he'd provided, the sacrifices he'd made. But she'd also observed his emotional absence, the phone calls he took in private, the way he seemed to live two completely separate lives. I want to help Eleanor, I told Rosa truthfully. But I also need to protect myself from the legal consequences of what's been happening. If Marcus faces charges, Eleanor's care will be disrupted. The house might be seized as proceeds of fraud. She could end up in a state facility. Rosa's face crumpled at the thought. She'd seen what happened to patients in understaffed, underfunded institutions. What you need from me? She asked. Documentation, I replied. Records of Marcus's visits, his emotional state, conversations you've overheard about finances or other family. A detailed account of Eleanor's condition and care needs. If this goes to court, I want to make sure Eleanor's interests are protected. As Rosa agreed to help, I realized I was building more than a legal case. I was constructing a narrative that would allow all three of us to survive this revelation with some semblance of dignity intact. Marcus would face consequences for his deception, but Eleanor would be protected. I would recover some compensation for years of unknowing fraud, but I wouldn't destroy a man whose only crime was loving too completely. The strategy was complex, requiring careful timing and precise execution. But for the first time since I'd discovered the tracker's first ping, I felt like I had some control over my own fate. I wasn't just a victim of Marcus's deception anymore. I was an architect of its resolution. Monday morning, I sat across from Rebecca Stone in her corner office at Hartley & Associates, watching my oldest friend from law school struggle to maintain professional composure as I laid out the evidence of my husband's double life. Rebecca specialized in high-stakes divorce litigation, the kind of cases where million-dollar settlements hung on discovered Swiss bank accounts and hidden assets. But even she seemed stunned by the complexity of Marcus's deception. Jesus, Isabella, she breathed, spreading the documents across her mahogany desk like tarot cards predicting disaster. This isn't just adultery or hidden assets. This is systematic fraud spanning nearly a decade. The legal implications are staggering. Rebecca's analysis was methodical and devastating. As Marcus's legal wife, Eleanor held rights that superseded any claim I might make to jointly acquired property. The penthouse we'd purchased together, the investment accounts we'd built, even my own retirement contributions that had been commingled with his, all of it could be claimed as marital property belonging to his legitimate marriage. But here's where it gets interesting, Rebecca continued, pulling up Oregon's fraud statutes on her computer. Marcus has been using community property from his legal marriage to fund assets in his bigamous relationship. Eleanor could sue to recover every dollar he spent on your life together. The cars, the vacations, even your engagement ring, technically, he bought it with her money. The financial analysis Rebecca had prepared made my stomach churn. Over 8 years, Marcus had systematically transferred approximately $847,000 from our joint accounts to Eleanor's care. Money I'd contributed through my salary, bonuses, and investment gains had been redirected to fund medical expenses, home modifications, and private nursing care. I'd essentially been paying for another woman's comfort while believing I was building a future with my husband. The criminal exposure is equally serious, Rebecca explained, her voice taking on the crisp tone she used when preparing clients for the worst-case scenarios. Bigamy is a felony in Oregon, carrying up to 5 years in prison. Add the mail fraud from false tax returns, wire fraud from electronic transfers, and insurance fraud from multiple policies, Marcus could be looking at federal charges with decades of prison time. More devastating than the potential criminal penalties was the professional destruction awaiting him. The Oregon Medical Board would immediately suspend his license pending investigation. Hospitals had zero tolerance for doctors involved in fraud cases, regardless of the underlying motivations. Marcus's career as a pediatric surgeon, the identity he'd built his entire adult life around, would be destroyed. Which brings us to Eleanor, Rebecca said quietly. If Marcus faces criminal charges, who takes care of her? Adult Protective Services will likely place her in a state facility while the legal mess gets sorted out. Her house could be seized as proceeds of fraud. Her carefully maintained care routine would be shattered. The cruel mathematics of justice became clear. Punishing Marcus for his deception would inevitably punish Eleanor for his choices, destroying an innocent woman whose only crime was losing her mind while married to a man capable of extraordinary devotion and elaborate lies. You have leverage, Rebecca observed, studying my expression carefully. Marcus can't afford for this to become public. His ability to care for Eleanor depends on maintaining his medical practice and avoiding criminal prosecution. You're in a position to dictate terms. We spent 3 hours crafting a strategy that balanced justice with pragmatism. Marcus would face consequences for his deception, but Eleanor would be protected from the collateral damage. I would recover compensation for my financial losses, but I wouldn't destroy a man whose primary motivation had been love, however misguided. The emotional preparation proved harder than the legal strategy. That evening, I sat in our penthouse living room, surrounded by 8 years of shared memories, and tried to reconcile the man I'd married with the stranger who'd been revealed by GPS coordinates and public records. Marcus wasn't a sociopath or a criminal mastermind. He was a man who'd made an impossible choice and then spent years trying to honor commitments that were fundamentally incompatible. But understanding his motivations didn't excuse the betrayal. Every anniversary we'd celebrated had been a lie. Every dream we'd shared had been built on a foundation of deception. Every time he'd told me he loved me while knowing he couldn't legally marry me, he'd stolen my agency, my right to make informed decisions about my own life. The confrontation would have to be surgical, precise, controlled, designed to achieve maximum clarity with minimal devastation. I wasn't seeking revenge, I was seeking resolution. A way for all three of us to move forward with honesty, even if we couldn't move forward together. Tuesday afternoon, I called Rosa from my office, my hands surprisingly steady as I dialed the number that would set everything in motion. The conversation required delicate choreography. I needed her cooperation without revealing the full scope of my deception or the legal consequences Marcus would soon face. Rosa, it's Janet from Adult Protective Services, I said, slipping back into my bureaucratic persona one final time. I need to conduct a follow-up visit with Eleanor this evening, around the time Marcus usually arrives. Would it be possible for you to stay late today? Rosa's concern was immediate. Is there a problem? Eleanor, she has been very stable. Marcus comes every day, reads to her, brings flowers. Care is very good. I'm sure it is, I replied. But I need to observe the family dynamic directly, see how everyone interacts when they think they're not being evaluated. It's standard procedure for our final report. The lie came easily now, my voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to having her deceptions believed. Rosa agreed to stay until 7 p.m., giving me a window to arrange the confrontation in Eleanor's living room, surrounded by the artifacts of Marcus's real marriage. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing documents with the methodical precision I'd learned in trial preparation. Copies of both marriage certificates, bank records showing the financial transfers, screenshots from the tracking app documenting Marcus's daily visits, legal briefs outlining the potential charges he faced. Everything organized in manila folders, presented like evidence in a case where the defendant was my own husband. The hardest part was writing the letter I'd leave for Marcus if he chose to fight rather than negotiate. 2 pages detailing his options: voluntary dissolution of our bigamous marriage with an agreed-upon settlement, or criminal prosecution that would destroy his career and Eleanor's care. I wasn't proud of using Eleanor as leverage, but Marcus had made his own choices about who deserved protection. Rebecca had prepared the annulment papers, technically, a petition to declare our marriage void from its inception. The settlement terms were fair but firm. Marcus would compensate me for my financial contributions to Eleanor's care, I would relinquish any claim to assets acquired during our relationship, and both of us would sign confidentiality agreements preventing public disclosure of the circumstances. At 5:30 p.m., I parked outside the Hawthorne Street house, my stomach churning with anticipation and dread. Rosa met me at the door with the same welcoming smile she'd shown during my previous visit, unaware that she was about to witness the destruction of the family dynamic she'd been protecting. Eleanor was having a good day, sitting in her wheelchair by the window, dressed in a lavender sweater that brought out the faded blue of her eyes. She smiled when she saw me, though I could tell she didn't remember our previous meeting. "Are you here to see Marcus?" she asked with the polite confusion of someone trying to navigate social conventions while her memory failed her. "He should be home soon. He always comes home to me." Home to me. The words were a knife twist, innocent and devastating in their honesty. This was Eleanor's home, Marcus's home, the place where their marriage lived and breathed despite her deteriorating mind. I was the intruder here, the other woman discovering the reality of where she actually stood in the hierarchy of her husband's heart. Rosa retreated to the kitchen, giving us privacy while staying close enough to intervene if Eleanor became agitated. I sat beside the wheelchair, surrounded by photographs of a love story that predated mine, and waited for the sound of Marcus's key in the lock. At exactly 6:15 p.m., I heard his footsteps on the front porch, the familiar rhythm of his walk that had once brought me comfort and now filled me with something approaching terror. The door opened, and Marcus stepped inside carrying a small bouquet of purple orchids, Eleanor's favorites, just as she'd mentioned during my first visit. He saw me before he saw Eleanor, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and dawning horror in the space of 3 heartbeats. The flowers slipped from his hands, scattering across the hardwood floor like beautiful evidence of a life about to be dismantled. "Isabella?" His voice was barely a whisper, his surgeon's composure cracking like ice under pressure. "What are you doing here? How did you—" "Hello, Marcus," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I think it's time we talked." Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, his face cycling through emotions too complex for any single expression to contain. Behind him, the October evening light was fading, casting long shadows across the living room where 3 lives were about to collide with the force of 8 years of accumulated deception. Eleanor looked up from her wheelchair, her eyes moving between Marcus and me with the sharp attention that sometimes emerged from her cognitive fog. "Marcus, darling," she said, her voice carrying a note of concern, "who is this lovely young woman? Did you invite her for dinner?" The question hung in the air like a prayer no one could answer. Marcus took a step forward, then stopped, as if the living room had become a minefield where any movement might trigger an explosion that would destroy everything he'd been trying to protect. "This is—" Marcus began, then faltered, his surgeon's precision abandoning him when he needed it most. "Eleanor, this is Isabella. She's someone I work with." "Work?" Eleanor's brow furrowed with the effort of processing information that didn't quite fit the patterns her damaged mind still recognized. "But it's evening, darling. You don't bring work home. You come home to me." I watched Marcus's face crumble as the implications of his situation became clear. He couldn't explain my presence without revealing the double life he'd constructed, but he couldn't dismiss me without acknowledging that I had every right to be part of this conversation. "Marcus," I said quietly, reaching into my briefcase and withdrawing the manila folders that contained the evidence of his deception. "I know about Eleanor. I know about your first marriage. I know about the money, the house, the lies. All of it." His legs seemed to give out beneath him, and he sank into the chair across from Eleanor's wheelchair with the boneless collapse of a man who'd been carrying an impossible weight for far too long. "How?" he whispered, his hands shaking as he stared at the folders in my lap. "GPS tracker," I replied, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "Attached to your car 3 weeks ago." 1847, Hawthorne Street, every weekday at 4:30 p.m. 2.5 hours each visit. I've been watching you live your real life, Marcus. Eleanor's attention sharpened suddenly, the way it sometimes did when her mind found temporary clarity in the midst of confusion. Marcus, she said, her voice carrying a note of authority that suggested the neurologist she'd once been, this woman seems upset. What haven't you told me? The question broke something fundamental in Marcus's composure. Tears began streaming down his face, not the careful, controlled emotion of a man managing a difficult situation, but the raw grief of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. Eleanor, he said, his voice thick with tears, I need to tell you something that's going to be very hard to hear. This is Isabella. She's the woman I've been living with for the past 8 years. I've been married to both of you. The words fell into the living room like stones into still water, creating ripples of silence that seemed to expand outward until they filled every corner of the space. Eleanor stared at Marcus with an expression that moved through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been understanding. Married to both of us, she repeated slowly, her damaged mind working to process information that would have been devastating to anyone, but seemed particularly cruel to someone whose grip on reality was already tenuous. But you're my husband, Marcus. You come home to me every day. I am your husband, Marcus said, reaching forward to take her hand with desperate tenderness. I've always been your husband. But I've also been living as Isabella's husband. Illegally. Wrongly. I've made a terrible mess of everything. I opened the first folder and spread the marriage certificates across the coffee table between us, his legal union with Eleanor, our meaningless ceremony that had never existed in the eyes of the law. 15 years, I said, my voice carrying the weight of revelation. You've been married to Eleanor for 15 years. Our entire relationship has been built on a lie. Eleanor picked up her marriage certificate with trembling fingers, studying it with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. This is us, she said wonderfully, looking at the photograph attached to the document. Look how young we were, Marcus. I remember this day. I wore my grandmother's dress. Marcus nodded, tears still streaming down his face. You were the most beautiful bride I'd ever seen. You are the most beautiful bride I've ever seen. But if you were already married to Eleanor, Eleanor said, her mind working with a clarity that was both heartbreaking and terrifying, then who is Isabella to you? Why does she seem so sad? The question pierced through my own composure. I'd spent weeks preparing for this confrontation, but I hadn't anticipated Eleanor's lucid participation in her own betrayal. She wasn't the victim of our deception, she was a participant in her own tragedy, forced to witness the revelation of lies that had been told to protect her. Eleanor, I said gently, Marcus and I have been living together. We thought we were married, but now I understand that wasn't possible because he was already married to you. I didn't know about you until recently. Eleanor nodded slowly, her expression moving through sympathy and something that might have been relief. So you're not trying to take him away from me, she said. You didn't know I existed. No, I replied, I didn't know. And I'm not trying to take him away from you. I'm trying to understand how we got here, and how we can move forward honestly. Marcus looked up from his hands, his face ravaged by grief but his voice steady for the first time since he'd walked through the door. Isabella, he said, I know there's no excuse for what I've done. But I need you to understand that when Eleanor was diagnosed, I couldn't abandon her. And when I met you, I couldn't give you up either. I tried to love you both completely, and I ended up betraying you both. I reached into the second folder and withdrew the bank records, the tracking logs, the evidence of 8 years of systematic deception. I understand your motivations, Marcus, I said. But understanding them doesn't change what you've done. You've stolen 8 years of my life, made me complicit in fraud, and built our entire relationship on lies that I never consented to live. Eleanor reached forward and touched my hand with fingers that were surprisingly strong. "I'm sorry," she said with perfect clarity. "I'm sorry that loving me cost you so much." The silence in Eleanor's living room stretched like a held breath, broken only by the soft ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece, a wedding gift, I now realized, from a ceremony I'd never been invited to witness. Marcus sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the weight of 8 years of carefully maintained deception finally crashing down around him. "Tell me everything," I said quietly, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years extracting truth from reluctant witnesses. "From the beginning. No more lies, Marcus. Eleanor deserves to know, and so do I." Marcus looked up, his face ravaged by tears but his surgeon's training finally reasserting itself. When he spoke, his voice carried the steady precision he used when explaining complex procedures to worried parents, each word measured and deliberate. "Eleanor was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's in March of 2017, he began, his eyes fixed on his wife's face as if drawing strength from her presence. "We'd been married for 9 years, living in Seattle. I was chief of pediatric surgery at Presbyterian, she was running the neurology department. We had everything: career success, financial security, a beautiful home overlooking Puget Sound. We were planning to start a family that summer." Eleanor nodded slowly, her mind apparently finding clarity in the familiar rhythm of their shared history. "I remember the diagnosis," she said softly. "Dr. Williams. He was so gentle when he told us. You held my hand so tightly I thought you might break my fingers." "The initial prognosis was devastating," Marcus continued, his voice thick with remembered grief. "Aggressive progression, maybe 5 years before complete cognitive failure. We went through all the stages: denial, anger, bargaining. I researched every experimental treatment, every clinical trial. I was going to save her, the way I saved children every day in the operating room." He paused, running his hands through his hair with the distracted gesture I'd seen him make countless times when he was processing difficult information. "But you can't operate on memories, Isabella. You can't cut out the part of someone's brain that's forgetting how to love you while leaving the rest intact." "What changed?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer from the financial records I'd analyzed. "Eleanor's symptoms accelerated faster than anyone predicted," Marcus replied, glancing between his wife and me with the careful attention of someone navigating emotional landmines. "By December, she was having episodes where she didn't recognize me. Her medical partners were pushing for her retirement. The stress was destroying both of us." Eleanor reached forward and touched Marcus's hand with the gentle certainty of muscle memory. "You are going to divorce me," she said matter-of-factly. "We discussed it during one of my clearer days. A legal separation so you could start over, find someone who could give you the life we'd planned." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Marcus had been prepared to leave Eleanor, to abandon his first marriage when her illness made their future impossible. The noble sacrifice I'd witnessed, the devoted husband reading poetry to his declining wife, all of it had been preceded by a moment when he'd chosen his own happiness over her need for care. "I filed the papers," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "January 15, 2018. No-fault divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Eleanor was going to move into a specialized facility, and I was going to start fresh somewhere else. Portland, maybe. I'd been offered a position at OHSU. But you never finalized it," I said, understanding beginning to dawn with the cold precision of legal logic. "I met you 3 weeks later," Marcus replied, looking at me with an expression that combined love and anguish in equal measure. "That gallery opening in downtown Seattle. You were standing in front of a painting of the Olympic Mountains, wearing this blue dress that matched your eyes. You laughed at something your friend said, and I knew I wanted to hear that sound for the rest of my life. The memory should have been romantic. Instead, it felt like evidence in a fraud case, another piece of the elaborate deception Marcus had constructed around our relationship. You were everything I'd dreamed of during those dark months with Eleanor, he continued. Brilliant, independent, passionate about your work. You didn't need me to take care of you. You wanted me because of who I was, not despite what I was going through. Eleanor squeezed Marcus's hand, her expression surprisingly peaceful for someone learning about her husband's emotional infidelity. She made you happy, she observed. I could see it when you came to visit me. You had light in your eyes again. But I couldn't finalize the divorce, Marcus said, his voice breaking completely. Every time I went to the lawyer's office, I would see Eleanor in the facility, confused and frightened, asking for me. The staff treated her like a problem to be managed, not a person who dedicated her life to healing others. I couldn't abandon her to that institutional neglect. The impossible choice crystallized before me. Marcus could either honor his legal commitment to Eleanor, providing her with the care and dignity she deserved, or he could build a future with me based on honesty and legitimate love. He couldn't do both without becoming a criminal. So you chose to live a double life, I said, surprising myself with how little anger I felt. The betrayal was still devastating, but I was beginning to understand the emotional mathematics that had led Marcus to this point. I told myself it was temporary, Marcus replied. Eleanor's prognosis was 5 years maximum. I could care for her until the end, and then Isabella and I could have a real life together. Legal marriage, children, everything we'd talked about. But Eleanor's condition stabilized, I observed, consulting the medical records I'd researched. She's had periods of decline followed by plateaus. The 5-year timeline became 8 years, and counting. Marcus nodded miserably. Every year, I told myself this would be the last year of deception. Every anniversary with you, I promised myself I'd tell you the truth after Eleanor was gone. But she kept fighting, kept having these moments of clarity where she was completely herself again. How do you divorce someone who still loves you, even if they can't always remember your name? The cruelest irony was that Marcus's capacity for devotion, the quality that had made me fall in love with him, was the same trait that had made him capable of sustaining such an elaborate deception. He'd loved both of us too completely to choose between us, and in trying to protect everyone, he'd ultimately betrayed us all. I opened the final folder and spread the legal documents across the coffee table with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent years building cases that could withstand aggressive cross-examination. Annulment papers, financial statements, criminal statute citations, everything arranged to present Marcus with a choice between cooperation and destruction. Here's your situation, I said, my voice taking on the crisp tone I used when explaining settlement terms to opposing counsel. Under Oregon law, bigamy is a Class C felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison. The federal charges for mail fraud and wire fraud could add decades to that sentence. Your medical license will be automatically suspended pending investigation, and no hospital in the country will hire a surgeon convicted of fraud. Marcus studied the documents with the focused attention he brought to surgical consultations, his mind apparently working through the implications with clinical detachment. Which means Eleanor loses her primary caregiver and her source of financial support, he said quietly. Exactly, I replied. If you're convicted, Adult Protective Services will place Eleanor in a state facility while the courts sort out asset forfeiture. The house you've been paying for with fraudulent funds could be seized. Rosa loses her job. Eleanor's carefully maintained routine gets destroyed. Eleanor had been listening to our conversation with the sharp attention that sometimes emerged from her cognitive fog, and now she spoke with the authority of someone whose professional training remained intact even as her personal memories faded. Marcus, she said firmly, what are Isabella's terms? The question surprised me with its directness. Even in her declining state, Eleanor understood the dynamics of negotiation, the balance between consequences and cooperation that would determine everyone's future. Voluntary annulment of our bigamous marriage, I replied, addressing Eleanor as much as Marcus. Marcus compensates me for my financial contributions to your care, approximately $280,000 over 8 years. I relinquish any claim to assets acquired during our relationship. Both of us sign confidentiality agreements. And Eleanor's care? Marcus asked, his primary concern evident in the question. Rosa keeps her job, funded through the settlement. Eleanor transitions to a high-quality memory care facility near Portland, where you can visit daily. I've researched 3 options, all better than the state institutions you're trying to avoid. The terms were harsh but fair, designed to punish Marcus's deception while protecting Eleanor from the collateral damage of his choices. I wasn't seeking to destroy him, but I couldn't allow 8 years of fraud to go without consequences. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his surgeon's mind working through the options with the same careful analysis he brought to complex medical decisions. Finally, he looked up with an expression that combined relief and resignation. What about my practice? He asked. Can I continue working? The confidentiality agreement protects your professional reputation, I replied. As far as the outside world knows, we had an amicable divorce due to irreconcilable differences. Your medical career continues uninterrupted. Eleanor reached for the annulment papers, studying them with the focused attention of someone whose legal training predated her medical career. This is fair, she said after several minutes. Marcus, you've sacrificed enough of your life for my illness. Isabella deserves compensation for what she's lost. The acceptance in Eleanor's voice was almost harder to bear than Marcus's grief. This woman, whose mind was slowly disappearing, was making rational decisions about the destruction of her marriage with more grace than either Marcus or I had managed. There's one more thing, I added, producing a document I'd prepared with Rebecca's help. I want Rosa designated as Eleanor's backup medical proxy, in case Marcus becomes unable to fulfill that role. She's been Eleanor's caregiver for 3 years, and Eleanor trusts her judgment. Rosa, who had been quietly listening from the kitchen doorway, stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. I will take good care of her, she promised in her careful English. Eleanor, she is like family to me. Marcus signed the papers with the steady hand of someone accustomed to making life-altering decisions under pressure. Each signature felt like a small death, the legal dissolution of 8 years of shared dreams and carefully constructed lies. 3 months later, Marcus moved into a 1-bedroom apartment 6 blocks from Sunrise Manor, the memory care facility where Eleanor had been placed after a month of careful transition planning. The facility was everything I'd promised: clean, well-staffed, designed specifically for Alzheimer's patients who needed specialized care but deserved dignity in their decline. I kept the penthouse, along with the settlement funds that would allow me to rebuild my life without the financial devastation that might have resulted from 8 years of unwitting fraud. The money felt tainted at first, like compensation for emotional damages that couldn't be quantified in dollars. But Rebecca had been right about the legal mathematics. I'd earned that compensation through years of unknowing subsidization of another woman's care. Marcus visited Eleanor every day, just as he had when she'd lived in the house on Hawthorne Street. The facility staff told me he read to her in the afternoons, brought fresh flowers twice a week, and maintained the kind of devoted presence that made Eleanor's transition easier than anyone had expected. Rosa had taken a position as Eleanor's private companion at the facility, funded through the settlement agreement. The arrangement gave Eleanor consistency of care while allowing Rosa to maintain the income she'd earned caring for someone who'd become more than just an employer. The divorce, technically an annulment, was finalized on a gray December morning, with all parties present in a downtown courtroom that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. Judge Martinez read the terms with the perfunctory efficiency of someone who'd processed hundreds of similar cases, unaware that she was dissolving a marriage that had never legally existed. Marcus and I exchanged a final handshake outside the courthouse, 2 people who'd loved each other completely and discovered that love without honesty was ultimately unsustainable. He looked older, worn down by the weight of maintaining his double life and then facing its consequences, but there was a clarity in his expression that hadn't been there during our 8 years together. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his words carried away by the Portland wind almost before I could hear them. I know, I replied, and found that I meant it. Eleanor had one more lucid moment during my final visit to see her settled at Sunrise Manor. She took my hand with surprising strength and looked at me with perfect clarity. "Thank you," she said, "for loving him well enough to let him go." As I drove away from the facility that afternoon, I realized that Eleanor had understood something about love that both Marcus and I had missed. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's lies, even when those lies are motivated by devotion. Spring arrived in Portland with the gentle persistence of someone knocking on a door they knew would eventually open. I stood in my penthouse kitchen, morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, preparing coffee for one instead of two for the first time in 8 years. The silence felt different now, not empty, but spacious, like a room that had been cleared of furniture that never quite fit. My promotion to senior partner at Morrison & Associates had come through in March, along with a corner office that overlooked the Willamette River and a caseload of high-stakes corporate litigation that challenged me in ways I'd forgotten I missed. Work had become a refuge during the dark months following the annulment, but now it felt like choice rather than escape. Dating again had been tentative at first, like learning to walk after a long illness. Coffee with David, a fellow attorney who specialized in environmental law and had never been married to anyone else. Dinner with Sarah, a graphic designer who painted in her spare time and believed that honesty was the foundation of everything worthwhile. Each connection was careful, deliberate, built on transparency rather than mystery. Marcus continued his daily visits to Sunrise Manor, where Eleanor's condition had stabilized into a predictable pattern of good days and difficult ones. The facility's social worker had called me once, a professional courtesy to update me on Eleanor's adjustment. She'd mentioned that Marcus seemed lighter somehow, unburdened by the weight of maintaining his double life even as he grieved the marriage that had ended not through death but through the necessary amputation of deception. Rosa had surprised me by accepting my offer of part-time housekeeping after her shifts at the facility ended. Our unlikely friendship had grown from mutual concern for Eleanor into something approaching sisterhood, two women who'd been caught in the gravitational pull of Marcus's elaborate sacrifice and had found their way to solid ground together. She brought me homemade pupusas on Fridays and stories about Eleanor's moments of clarity, keeping me connected to the resolution of a story I'd never wanted to be part of but couldn't completely leave behind. The house on Hawthorne Street had sold to a young family with children, their laughter replacing the quiet dignity of Eleanor's decline with the chaos of normal life. Sometimes I drove past it on my way to other destinations, noting the swing set in the backyard and the bicycles on the front porch, evidence that some stories end with new beginnings rather than just endings. The GPS tracker sits in my junk drawer now, a small black device that once held the power to destroy my world and ultimately gave me the strength to rebuild it. I keep it as a reminder that intuition isn't paranoia, that the voice whispering something's wrong deserves to be heard even when listening to it might shatter everything you think you know about your life. I've learned that love without honesty isn't love at all, it's possession, control disguised as devotion. Marcus loved both Eleanor and me, but his refusal to let either of us choose our own participation in his story turned that love into a form of emotional imprisonment. The kindest thing he could have done was trust us with the truth, even if that truth was painful enough to end everything we'd built together. Some nights, when Portland's rain drums against my windows and the city lights blur into watercolor memories, I think about the woman I was before I discovered that tracker app. She was naive in ways that feel both precious and dangerous now, willing to accept explanations that didn't quite add up because she wanted to believe that good people didn't lie about the fundamental facts of their lives. But I've also learned that survival isn't just about recognizing deception, it's about rebuilding yourself into someone who deserves honesty, who demands it not from a place of suspicion but from a place of self-worth. I'm not the same woman who married Marcus Chin in a ceremony that meant everything to me and nothing to the law. I'm someone stronger, clearer, more willing to trust the voice that says pay attention when something doesn't feel right. If my story resonated with you, if it helped you see the signs you've been ignoring or gave you permission to trust that nagging feeling in your gut, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. I want to know, what would you have done in my situation? Would you have confronted Marcus immediately, or would you have gathered evidence the way I did? Your thoughts matter to me, so tell me in the comments below because I read every single one. And if you want more stories from Voices of Rosa, stories about women who found their truth in the darkest moments and came out stronger on the other side, subscribe and hit that notification bell. There are so many more voices waiting to be heard, so many women who've walked through fire and lived to tell about it. Until next time, this is Isabella, reminding you that your instincts are your greatest gift. Trust them, even when, especially when, trusting them means your comfortable life might fall apart. Because sometimes the only way to build something real is to first destroy everything fake. Your truth is waiting for you to be brave enough to find it.